I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at the intense fighting in the south around the occupied city of Kherson, the start of which some believe is the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive. We also explore a fascinating aspect of Ukraine's fightback against Russian disinformation. Welcome to the world of NAFO, the Fellows, and images of Shiba Inu dogs. Confused? Listen on.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 30th of August, day 188, and today I'm joined by the Telegraph's associate editor, Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor, Francis Durnley, and our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the war zone.
Hi David, hi everybody. It's been a very busy 24 hours. There are multiple and credible reports that the long-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive is underway. I'm adding a note of caution there because there should always be scepticism with first and early military reports, but it does look like there is a broad offensive going on rather than just any kind of shaping operation that we spoke about last week. So on Monday night, in a video last night, Alexei Arestovich, advisor to President Zelensky, said that Ukrainian forces had broken through, that's his quote, broken through Russia's defences. So here's my first alarm bell. Broken through, I mean, it implies a kind of crust beyond which there's green open fields you can motor across. Doesn't always work like that. Don't think it works like that here. Certainly in British military doctrine, all-round defence and depth are principles of defence. So I question whether or not there is any breaking through here. I would have thought there'd be a very large structure of Russian defences put in place. But just take that with a pinch of salt. There has been shelling on the bridges over the Dnipro River, the Antonovsky Bridge, that was hit last night. We think the hydroelectric dam and bridge further to the east has also been hit. The hastily constructed pontoon bridges that Russia has put in place over the last few weeks across the river have also been hit. Russia, for its part, I mentioned this just to mark it and move on. Yesterday, Sunday, Russia said there's no offensive, and today they're saying the offensive has stalled. So you simply can't have it both ways. My point is, don't go to Russia state media for any news on this. It's going to be false. Otherwise, Ukraine has been very quiet. Now, I mark that because in recent weeks there's been a lot of talk about an offensive in the south. I mean, this has partly been, I think, a clever strategy to draw attention away from the Donbass. As HIMARS and the other multiple launch rocket systems have depleted long-range artillery, Russian artillery in that area, the attacks have dwindled to an absolute trickle. But Russia have also been forced to make this massive left hook, this huge push to the south to push other forces to the Kherson area in anticipation of this assault. So I think it was quite clever by Ukraine to message that Russian forces on the move are not able to particularly fight from the line of march as we've seen. However, now that another thing to suggest that this is actually a proper offensive is the fact Ukraine have gone very quiet on their strategic comms. President Zelensky says that no one sensible would actually be talking about it right now. So I think their reluctance to engage in this on the narrative is quite telling. It looks as if there are broadly four axes of advance from Ukraine's lines. Firstly, a thrust towards Kherson city around the coastline and on the main highway, the direct main highway from the sort of Mykolaiv area. That's about 50 k's. Then it looks like there's a push a little bit further to the east, down both banks, the east and the west bank of the Inelets River. And then finally, another push further to the east of that, which would be on the sort of extreme right flank of the Russian forces. And that's in the area of Zaporizhia, not as close as Zaporizhia and not near the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, which is not directly in the town itself, but it's over to the east. And I'll just finish for this moment with the latest UK Defence Intelligence Assessment, which is saying that the Russian Southern Military District's 49th Combined Arms Army seems to have been augmented with the Eastern Military District's 35th Combined Arms Army. And UK Defence Intelligence is saying, quote, cohesion of this untested structure will likely be a key factor in the sustainability of Russia's defences in the south, unquote. And I mention that because just putting military units together and expecting them to crack on and rush forwards to glory, it just doesn't work like that. So if Russia is having to put two very large structures like Combined Arms Army, the clue's in the title, this is a big force. If they're putting two together from different military districts of Russia, it speaks of what they're able to put in the field, but also that does not augur well. I would be very surprised if a structure of that size is suddenly able to just marry up and get on with something, especially as complex as a defence against a counteroffensive. I'll just take a little pause there, let Joe come in, and we maybe come back later.
Thanks very much for that, Dom. Joe and Francis, let's go to Joe first. Joe, you've been writing about this assault since it started. What would you like to add to Dom's thoughts?
So Dom's made quite an interesting point, and I think the first point is we should kind of err on the side of caution when we're looking at about what is going to happen, what could happen. So ultimately, the Ukrainian goal, you would have to think, is to capture Kherson, the city. It was the first kind of major city captured by Russian forces in late February. And it's the only regional capital in Ukraine that's still kind of under Russian occupation. And so what's been quite interesting with this long-awaited kind of counteroffensive, if it has started, has been kind of billed and spoken about amongst Ukrainian officials, politicians and the like for now 2 months. If we know it's coming, so do the Russians. And they've actually, so about this time last month, they had 13 tactical battalion groups in and around Kherson. And now that, according to Roshan Consulting, who are a kind of an independent military kind of analysts, is now kind of over double, and they estimate around 30 BTGs are kind of in the Kherson area. So it's not a kind of going to be an easy kind of walk through for Ukrainian forces. So BTGs are normally made up of around 800 soldiers plus hardware. There are kind of some intelligence briefings that suggest that some of the BTGs moved over might be kind of unmanned. They might be low on manpower. They're made up and hobbled together, as Don was saying, of kind of the remnants of old units that have been kind of defeated across various kind of stages of the war in Ukraine. So that's kind of the hint of warning. But there was some kind of interesting and kind of fun stories that we kind of heard as initial kind of reports came out and people started kind of confirming, whether it be the spokeswoman for the Southern Operational Command, which is kind of that unit of the Ukrainian army, or just kind of Telegram chatter. And so one of the interesting ones, apparently when there was first reports of the lines being broken, Ukraine forced the 109th Regiment of the so-called People's Republic of Donetsk to retreat from their position. And then that was apparently followed with reports that a group of Russian paratroopers that were sent to support them were also kind of forced away, and they fled the battlefield. And it was, again, they were followed by videos of kind of hastily abandoned ammunition that kind of local Ukrainian news channels claimed to be kind of from abandoned Russian positions. But obviously we've got to take that with a pinch of salt, because we cannot confirm it ourselves. And then other things we heard that Ukraine had used tanks, they'd used aircraft, mainly helicopters, as well as kind of the HIMARS and other multi-launch rocket systems to kind of make the initial kind of breakthrough that have been claimed. So, and I think it might be one for Dom to address, is the actual importance of Ukraine being able to use tanks on the ground. Because HIMARS are great if you want to kind of disrupt supply lines and enemy bases far behind kind of the front line. But if you're actually going to have to capture territory and do it quickly, you're going to need kind of a big presence of kind of armoured vehicles and tanks.
Thanks, Joe. Francis, I know you've got quite a few thoughts on this. Do you want to come in quickly before Dom talks about the sort of the so what? What does this actually mean?
I would first start by echoing what Dom and Joe have said about urging caution on this. But nonetheless, I think it's important to talk about this as a hugely symbolic moment in the war. I mean, this is a country that was on its knees a few months ago, and now it is capable of launching, so we understand, a counter-offensive against one of the world's largest land armies. It's pretty extraordinary. We spoke at length last week about whether Ukraine had the capacity to do this and whether they may well have missed their opportunity because they didn't feel that they had the weaponry to do so, and that may well still be true. Indeed, one point of concern here, of course, is that they may have been very sensitive to one argument that's been put forward, that it would be very dangerous for Ukraine to enter winter without seeking to launch some kind of counterattack and thereby showing Europe and America that they are here for the long haul and are committed. And there's, of course, a danger that they have sought to do so without being fully prepared. And as a consequence, that this may well perhaps not be the great counterattack, the great breakthrough that has been advertised. Nonetheless, the opening signs are very promising for the reasons that Joe and Dom have just been talking about. I was actually in the office yesterday at the Telegraph, and when we first started getting the reports coming in, and you could already get the sense then, and over the hours that followed, that those who've been following this war very closely, whether it be military analysts, those in Ukraine, senior political figures, were getting very, very excited by what was going on. We knew that this was something quite extraordinary, and thus it has proved. As I say, though, we don't yet know what Ukraine is capable of, and we should, as I say, as a consequence of that, not perhaps expect sort of the liberation of Kherson imminently. This is more likely to be a long-term campaign as opposed to a short one. But there are also, as I say, a risk in terms of how this is perhaps being advertised somewhat, which is that you've already got commentators saying that now it would be a failure if Kherson were not recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. And the question I would ask is, can Ukraine really afford that, entering winter, not being able to take this city back, which now is clearly the target of their campaign. Thus far in the war, Ukraine, I would argue, has largely under-promised its capabilities, but has more than over-delivered. There's some sense that on this one they are really trying to say that they are launching a major counteroffensive. And whilst there is a huge morale boost in that, and I say a huge symbolic value in that, there is also a danger that if you over-promise and under-deliver, that will also play against you. But as I say, there's no evidence for that yet, but those are some of the complex problems that we're going to have to try and unravel together over the coming days.
Thanks, Francis. Dom, do you want to come in at all?
Yeah, just briefly, let's have a look at the so what's here. I mean, what does it mean? Why now, basically? I mean, Francis mentioned that there is great need for Ukraine to have a significant victory to show the world before the winter crisis hits us, or before winter hits and the winter fuel crisis hits certainly us in Europe and probably elsewhere as well. But Ukraine need to be able to show that they can win this thing to keep the international sport going through the long, dark months. I think that's widely considered accurate. But so what have they been doing? There's been a steady Ukrainian build-up of forces. There's a great piece in today's paper from Joe talking about how Ukraine have been building dummy HIMARS, for example, out of wood and cardboard. I mean, the classic deception technique of having blow-up tanks and what have you that I used to play around with, and that are still in service. And that Russia has gone after these with some very high-end kit, Iskander missiles and what have you, utilising limited precision-guided munitions it's got. We've seen the build-up with Ukraine MLRS and HIMARS and so on and so forth. We've seen them drop the bridges in the Kherson area, and they are attacking on a broad front. Now, that takes a hell of a lot of effort to have a broad and deep offensive. You need a deep offensive, otherwise there's no point in starting it, really, unless it's a little raiding probe. But that would come into the shaping operation. If it's part of a counter-offensive, then you need to have depth to your attack, otherwise you're not taking it seriously, basically. So a broad attack front is is helpful. It also keeps the Russians off guard because they don't know where to put their reserves, which is all important. And it allows Ukraine to reinforce success. So if they push through in one area, they can sort of give up the advance in another area to back that, to reinforce the success and keep going there. So a broad front makes sense, and it's evident, we think, from what little we've seen so far, that they've spent the last few months building up the requisite forces there. I want to say requisite forces. Of course, this is not just one part of the orchestra. To be able to do this, you need tanks and infantry working together under an air defence umbrella with artillery on call. You need logistics support. You need those logistic lines to be robust and to have other lines in place that can quickly step in if something's knocked out. You need medical support up there. You need command headquarters. You need alternate command headquarters. You need step-up headquarters when you're on the move. So this is a huge undertaking, an offensive, and I think that suggests that if this is the big push for now, that's probably it for the year, because we think Ukraine, like Russia, have been very severely depleted in the war so far. Now, on the Russian side, we know their forces have been degraded. We've seen a number of ammo dumps, command and control facilities, airfields in Crimea going up in the wee small hours at HIMARS o'clock. Their command seems to be in chaos. There's been a number of generals who have been sacked, moved about. That's quite normal in war, actually. If things aren't working, you replace people, but not normal to replace so many so quickly. That speaks of either people not being very good at their job, or a political imperative run out of control. So not giving people time to. I mean, I know this is men and women we're talking about, but to make mistakes, and mistakes will happen and are, dare I say it, necessary to happen for great commanders to become great. But the command seems to be in chaos. We'll talk about Sergei Shoigu in a minute, the Russian defense minister, who seems to be sidelined and out of favor at the moment. Putin seems to be bypassing him and talking directly to his operational commanders. So that's not good at a very senior strategic level. Russia is off balance, as I've said, with the bridges that have been dropped, capturing, we think, some thousands north and west of the Dnipro River. The move to the south that I mentioned earlier on has blobbed them out, and they are sort of strung out between the Donbass and the Kherson region. So Russia's off balance, and so it makes sense for Ukraine to launch an attack now. However, we should bear in mind that this is not an end. Let's assume for a moment, let's take it as read, that Ukraine pushes as far as the Dnipro River, takes back Kherson city and all the land down to the river. That will be an operational victory, not a strategic victory. That will be operational, as in it will affect the battlefield. It could be a turning point on the battlefield. It's not going to be a turning point in the overall war. What then happens from Russia? Putin has yet to declare war. He's talked about. We heard last week how they were going to mobilise another 137,000 soldiers. It's like, yeah, okay. That will take years to raise, equip, train, and embed that kind of number into your system. So that's not going to happen for a while. So does he declare war in terms able to use all the levers at his disposal? There has been talk of what would a military defeat on this scale look like to Russia, and would that be a cause to use tactical nuclear weapons? I don't think so, because I think that is still a leap, even for some of the erratic decisions that we've seen from Putin and the senior Russian military leadership. I think it is still a bit of a leap to do that, to reach for tactical nuclear weapons, although that is in their doctrine. If military defeat is expected, I think it's a bit of a leap without war having been declared. But what else can they do? There could be an accident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We were looking at that last week. Russia just today has been accusing Ukraine of more shelling over the weekend. There are marks you can see in today's Telegraph and online. We've got images from Maxar Technology showing that there are marks on buildings near the reactors in Zaporizhzhia, which seem to be the result of shelling. Of course, Russia is saying this is Ukraine. Ukraine saying it's not. Is this a false flag? We don't know. But that could be a precursor to some horrific staged event there in in response to this assault. And of course, don't forget that last week's or during last week, the UK Defence Intelligence Assessment did show images of tanks and other military vehicles, Russian tanks and vehicles, within 60 metres of reactor number 5 at Zaporizhia. So some kind of disproportionate response, disproportionate both in scale and in the type of response, not a direct battlefield response from Russia, could be on the cards here. I don't think they will go for tactical nuclear weapons, but Zaporizhia is looking very vulnerable, and I'm pretty nervous at the moment because the command, strategic and operational levels in the Russian military and defence framework seem to be in chaos, and we don't know quite what levers there are between Putin and ground level. But we just need to think of the so whats. And to echo Francis's point, what would victory look like in this battle alone, just in this bit alone? What would victory look like for Ukraine? Or conversely, if they do not, let's say they take all the ground, all the countryside, but do not take Kherson city, would that be deemed good enough? A question for us to discuss over the next few weeks.
Thanks very much, Dom. Can I just pick out two stories there to talk slightly more about? You've both flagged them. One is on these dummy HIMARS. Joe, you wrote the story for The Telegraph on this. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about what the Ukrainians did and why it was so effective? And then, as you mentioned, I think we'd better talk about Sergei Shoigu and his estrangement from Putin and what that might mean. But first, on the dummy HIMARS, Joe Barnes.
Sure. So there has this stories emerged out of Ukraine about how the Ukrainian army or government authorities have commissioned the construction of wooden kind of contraptions that look like the US provided HIMARS rocket systems, which have been used to kind of devastating effect by the Ukrainian forces, whether it be knocking out kind of Russian supply lines, bridges, command and control posts, and ammunition dumps that we've seen kind of in the last 2 months. And so a Ukrainian official has told the Washington Post newspaper that decoy versions of these HIMARS that have been dotted around kind of Ukrainian countryside waiting to be found have drawn fire from at least 10 caliber cruise missiles fired from Moscow's kind of naval fleet in the Black Sea. They are one of Moscow's kind of precision weapons stockpiles that Western kind of officials have been warning have been running low since April. So losing these missiles is kind of a real blow for the Russian armed forces because they just don't have that many of them, apparently. And so basically what these wooden kind of dummy HIMARS are doing is they're being dotted around the countryside, and then the Russian artillery drones are sent up into the sky to basically look for Ukrainian targets. And they basically, their eyes light up because they cannot distinguish between whether it being a real HIMARS or a dummy kind of mock-up wooden version of the weapon. So they radio back into kind of headquarters and go, look, we've got one in our sights, let's do it. And they pull the trigger, send up a precision missile, and they then celebrate that they've destroyed this weapon. And say Washington has shipped 16 HIMARS to Ukraine so far. And many people laugh that Russia has claimed to have destroyed more HIMARS than has been sent by Washington. So that basically alludes to the fact that they've been knocking out these dummy versions pretty consistently since they kind of emerged on the battlefield. But I think the other really interesting thing to consider is the Russians are actually quite terrified of the HIMARS. They've been constantly forced to kind of rejig their supply lines and where their ammunition dumps are, constantly moving them kind of further and further out of range of the HIMARS, which can strike to about, I think people have said they can land on a penny on a table about 50 miles away. So they are kind of a real precision kit. So by using these decoys and placing them around, you can slowly start spooking the Russians into moving their kind of artillery ammo dumps further out of range, which makes it harder for them to kind of resupply their front lines. And it's just a fascinating kind of version of kind of hybrid war that we've seen during this conflict. And I know Dom mentioned there's kind of historical precedent to it. Even so, I did a bit more research and kind of flicking through the archives of what we've seen so far in Ukraine, and we've seen scarecrow soldiers that were dressed up in helmets, army uniforms, body armors. They were equipped with NLAW anti-tank rockets, Stinger anti-aircraft launchers. And they were just dotted around the countryside in the early day of the conflict, hoping to basically kind of either cause a retreat or kind of almost let the Russians uncover their position while firing on them. And then the other one that we've seen is cars have been disguised as kind of armoured vehicles by both sides in an attempt to con the opposition forces. But I think the wooden HIMARS is the kind of the most effective version we've seen in causing or forcing the Russians to spend kind of limited and costly ammunition in the caliber rockets and other precision missiles they might have. So it's been a kind of a real boost, and I'm sure it's probably helped Ukraine in preparing the shaping exercise and the lines ahead of this counteroffensive in the south.
It feels very pre-D-Day, doesn't it? Lots of armies of wooden tanks and wooden systems. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Joe, for that. Francis, would you like to come in on that at all?
Well, the only thing I would just mention, you mentioned World War II, is there's been a lot of speculation that the attack on Kherson may echo in some ways the Battle of Normandy, and specifically the Battle of the Falaise Gap in 1944, which was the decisive engagement of the Normandy campaign when the Allies tried to encircle and entrap the German soldiers who were fighting around the town of Falaise. And whilst many Germans managed to escape, there were still, I think, around 50,000 who were trapped in the pocket before it closed. And obviously that came as a huge consequence when they were forced to surrender. And as I say, there are some who are speculating that the Ukrainians are seeking to cut off, with their attacks on the bridges and also through their now military advance, the Russian escape route, and try and cut those off who are currently stationed in Kherson. But as I say, I think we should be very hesitant to go too far in our analogies, not least because in 1944 the Allies had air superiority, and I think it's fair to say that whilst Ukraine has a far more effective air force than we predicted, they do not have superiority, and that had a huge influence on the eventual outcome and success of the Falaise Gap campaign. But I wanted to specifically talk a little bit about Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister of the Russian state. Now, as Dom alluded to, Putin has reportedly ordered generals to actually bypass him, Mr. Shoigu, because he's being blamed for the stalled invasion. The reason I wanted to focus on this is twofold, really. Of course, on the first hand, it's very significant at this very moment as the counterattack has been launched. It's not a good look for Russia when you effectively sideline, or maybe, who knows, effectively fire the person who's been in command of the campaign. It would speak to things not going in the direction that you've wanted them to. But the other reason I wanted to mention it is we predicted this on the podcast many, many months ago. We spoke about the problem with Shoigu is that he is a classic example of a commander who has risen the ranks of the Russian state because he has effectively played the political game. He said the right things. He's shaken hands with the right people. And his own actual capabilities as a defence minister have always and long been questioned, and those who have perhaps been more effective, more honest in their appraisals of the Russian capability within Russia have been sidelined because of Shoigu basically saying the right things and saying that he can do this. He reminds me very much of a Hermann Goering type character, somebody who says, "Oh yes, no problem, we can do that, no problem at all," and then actually when push comes to shove, they don't really know what they're talking about in terms of the capabilities of the armed forces. Most famously, of course, Hermann Goering did this in the Battle of Stalingrad. He promised that he would be able to keep the Sixth Army resupplied after that campaign went sour, and Hitler, as a consequence, made several strategic calculations which ultimately led to the defeat of the Sixth Army, and that was largely the responsibility of the fact that he believed that the Sixth Army could be resupplied by the Luftwaffe, which was not the case thanks to effectively the lies, or at least the delusions of Hermann Goering. So I wanted to just to draw in on Sergei Shoigu because of this important significance in terms of the war generally. But of course, on the other hand, I think we shouldn't necessarily see this as only as a sort of positive when framed in that way, because the blunt truth is there are many instances in wars that are not going a side's way, where those who have been making key strategic decisions have been replaced and by more effective commanders who have changed strategy and have thereby been successful. The one that leaps out at me is, for the benefit of our American listeners, is of course the American Civil War. The commander of the Union forces, General McClellan, was in many ways seen as a successful builder of armies, but not a very successful man once he had them under his command on the battlefield. And after successive defeats, or at least not making decisive operational successes, most famously at the Battle of Antietam in 1863, Lincoln relieved him of command and put other generals in command of the Union side, perhaps most notoriously Ulysses S. Grant, who went on to become president himself. And that totally shifted the trajectory of the war from the Union side. What were once Pyrrhic victories or even defeats against the Confederacy eventually became a success after success after success. And so whilst in many ways, as I say, I think Shoigu's sidelining is significant and speaks to things going wrong in the Russian military space, there is another side to this, which is, what if another person takes over in overall command who is actually more effective? What could that mean for the trajectory of the war? We don't know, but again, another issue for us to untangle in the weeks ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. Dom and Joe, do you have anything more to add on the counteroffensive in the south?
Well, just one final point there to follow on from Francis. Of course, the other person we've seen very little of recently is Gerasimov, Valery Gerasimov, the head of Russia's armed forces. We've heard almost nothing of him recently. He went into the Donbass a couple of months ago now, and was, we are led to believe from very credible sources, injured in an artillery strike there. I believe a bodyguard was killed in that. But we've heard almost nothing of him, and he was apparently the architect of the Gerasimov doctrine, this thing we should all quake in our boots reading. This was Russia's amazing ability to wield all the levers of national power to win strategically. So interesting that Shoigu and Gerasimov seem to be silenced, quiet, pushed to one side. We don't know what would happen next, but of course, so far in this war, we've seen commanders replaced and then replaced themselves. So it doesn't speak well. I mean, think about Dvornikov. Gerasimov kind of went into the country and he said all the different fronts were going to come together under General Dvornikov, and then within weeks he was sacked. So yes, we should be very wary of what might come next. We should also be very wary of a vacuum between sort of Putin and the operational commanders, that level of that military strategic, military political interface. If that is absent, then all sorts of chaos can run riot in there. And so we should be very wary of celebrating any perceived chaos in the Russian structures. Very, very early in this counteroffensive with huge risks attendant from all sides. So, yeah, take the news as it comes and mark it that there does seem to be some kind of chaos at Russia's leadership. But yeah, we should be very wary of what that might presage.
Thanks very much, Dom. Joe, anything from you? And then I think we've got a few more updates on the diplomatic front before we talk about the fellas. And don't worry, we'll get to that.
Yeah. So the one thing that it probably brings Dom in, it would be how is Ukraine, as they kind of make this offensive, going to be able to shift their own tactical kind of approach to the war? So what we've seen is in recent weeks, and kind of US and European officials have conceded this, that Ukraine have been given a kind of a blueprint that was drawn up by the US Special Operations team on how to fight Russia and its vastly kind of superior and larger army, which was put together in the wake of Russia's war with Georgia and Ukraine. And it's all about kind of guerrilla and resistance fighting, kind of using not underhand tactics, because obviously you're being invaded, but using kind of tactics of deceit and deception and kind of using creating partisan forces and stuff. But now it moves to a slightly more conventional ground war in the south. Are we going to actually be able to see whether Ukraine can actually kind of move to this tactical approach, and can they actually prove effective, or as effective as they have been with their resistance fighting kind of defensive approach that they've used so effectively in the last few months.
Dom, would you like to come back on that?
Well, they've got two big things I would suggest. Firstly, moving from the defence to the offence is very, very tricky. Two completely different modes of warfare. And secondly, of course, over the last few months, Ukraine, with huge Western help, has been transitioning from a former Soviet style of building and equipping and training a force to NATO standard, and that goes everything from the caliber of weapons being fired to the equipment that's being supplied, the training on it, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this will be one for the historians, because I can't think of an army that has transitioned so far so quickly and then been thrown into such a fight in the kind of time scale that Ukraine has. So this is the first real test since the Western weapons have been flowing in. It's pushed back the Russian artillery, and that has led to the stalled advance in the Donbass, largely led to the stalled advance in the Donbass, and shaped this battle to come. But in terms of combined arms manoeuvre, as I said earlier on, the whole orchestra playing, the tanks and the infantry and the engineers and the signals, intelligence, medics, logistics, the whole lot, all working together. This is the first really big test, I think, for Ukraine, and to do it, having taken a pounding for 6 months and transitioning to new weapon systems and ways of working, I think is extraordinary. So there's huge risks here, and yeah, I think if it is successful, and jury's out on what success will look like, but yeah, I think this is very definitely one for the historians about how a military can transform in contact. And by in contact, I mean fighting the other side. If you're in a fist fight and you're trying to do your shoelaces up with one hand and keep the other fellow away with the other. I mean, it's extraordinarily difficult. To transition in contact is very, very difficult. The British military, with Commonwealth allies in the First World War, managed it in through sort of 1917, and by 1918 was just a juggernaut that then rolled east. But it takes a long time to do it, to change your structures and equipments and everything whilst in contact with the enemy is a colossal undertaking. To do that on new equipment and new doctrine is something else entirely. So we shouldn't underestimate exactly how hard this is. Not least of which is the ratios you need, the numbers you need if you're defending, vice if you're attacking. So yeah, a massive undertaking here for Ukraine.
Dom Nichols, you're part of the Fellows, you're part of NAFO now. To those listening who never heard of that, no idea what I'm saying, can you explain briefly, because it's a new front in the information war. NAFO have been around now for a few months, or even longer. It's been picked up a few times by international media. I think Vice did a very interesting thing on it. The Yorkshire Post did something the other day. But you are now a fellow. What does that involve, and who are they?
Yeah, we've mentioned this briefly a few weeks ago, I think. So this is a fascinating aspect of the information war that's going on here. And I've got a nod to Oz Chatterjee, who's listening in. And Oz, I do apologise if I've mispronounced your name. I'm so sorry. But Oz put out a great thread on Twitter a couple of days ago. You should all go and read it about the Fellows and NAFO. So NAFO, what is it? It's the North Atlantic Fellows Organisation. That doesn't really answer it. But basically, this is a grassroots counter-disinformation campaign challenging Russian nonsense. So Russia for years has been held up as a master of the dark arts of misinformation and manipulating the media landscape, if you like, the information flank of any confrontation. And what's been shown is that meeting Russian absurdity with facts, fact checking and truth just isn't working. It doesn't work because they just deflect and move on to something else, and you never land a blow. It's like fighting with smoke. So what NAFO is, it was started. I mean, well, to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure how it started, where it started, but NAFO is an international group with we think many thousands of people in it who have just decided to meet nonsense with nonsense. So they challenge Russian disinformation online with just absurdities to tie them up in knots. And it's effectively a great big raspberry to every Russian piece of disinformation that's put out there. And it's I don't know how to explain this, but to be a fella, you can buy stuff off the St. Javelin website, with which is sort of good merch of Ukrainian, the war in Ukraine. Good merch there. I've got a mug and a T-shirt on the way. Or you can donate to the Georgian Legion, and then you can apply with proof of your donation or your purchase. You can then apply to the fellas and say, "Can I have a fella of my own?" And you then describe what you'd like your little fella to look like. Now, fellas are based around Shiba Inu dogs, the Japanese hunting dogs. Stick with me at the back. I know it's getting a bit confusing. I'm massively confused myself, but that's the delightful nonsense of all this. Okay, so the fellas are just little cartoon dogs dressed up as the fellow wishes it to be, and you can then do whatever you like. And the idea is that you tie up Russian disinformation channels in knots. And firstly, I mean, just for the sheer fun of it, because they might think they're good at misinformation, but actually what they're not very good at is arguing and trying to get into a debate with a cartoon dog. It's just worth the entry price alone. But what it does, it keeps us on the agenda, keeps the war on the international agenda. It shows that there is nowhere to hide for Russia. It opens up the information flank, which is a bit wonkish, but I hope people understand what I mean by that. It allows people to feel empowered, ordinary people who might not feel that they can do anything in this war. I mean, I'm lucky. We're lucky here. We've got a voice. We've got a microphone. We've got an audience. We've got a good brand behind us, so people listen to us. God knows why. But we've got a voice. Now, many people don't, and this is a way of allowing people to have a vote, and allowing people to feel empowered, and allowing people to feel part of this. And I think that's important. The more people around the world feel part of, turning around to Russia and saying, "No, that's not acceptable. What you're doing is just not the way we do it anymore in the world." And this is a very small way of doing it, and a very small way of being part of a bigger gang. Now, as Oz says, and I again urge you to go and have a look at his thread, Russia is now having to devote time to belittling and countering this army of cartoon dogs. It's brilliant, and they're wasting time with that instead of, as he puts it, atrocity revisionism, unquote, which I think is a great way of thinking about it. The more time they spend arguing with cartoon dogs, then the less time they've got for putting out any other rubbish. So it is, it is not, as some people have suggested, glorifying war or making fun of extreme violence. It's not that at all. I think it's a way of the individual fighting back. Certainly those without a voice, or with less of a voice than some others of us who are lucky to have platforms such as this. But what it does is it says to Russia, no, there's no hiding space. When you come out with nonsense, we will meet you with nonsense. We know it's nonsense, and you try and argue with us, which is absolutely brilliant. So I urge you all to have a look at St. Javelin, have a look at just if you're on Twitter as you are now, but if you're listening to the podcast and you're able to get on Twitter, have a look at hashtag NAFO, NAFO, NAFO fellas. Just have a look around, and you'll just see what's going on. Don't be scared when you look at it and goes, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I feel a little bit scared by it. That's you're in the right place. So don't worry about it. I am now a fella. I'm waiting for my personalised fella to come through. I wanted to do it now in time for this Twitter Space and podcast, but the fella Forge is busy making lots of other little fellas at the moment, I'm told. I was offered one to borrow for today, but it was a play on The Silence of the Lambs, and I didn't really like that. So I'll wait for my own fellas to come through before we have a look. But I urge you to go and have a look at it, and do please read Oz's thread, because I'm making light of it here, and that's the whole point. It's to meet absurdity with absurdity and counter Russia's disinformation campaign, and I urge everyone to have a look.
Thanks, Dom. Just very quickly, what was the... we were talking before this space, and you mentioned a phrase uttered by some Russian official in response to sort of intense trolling by the fellas on Twitter. What was it again? Because that's kind of one of the things that catapulted NAFO to internet stardom.
Okay, so this was Mikhail Ulyanov, who's Russia's representative to Vienna, to the international organisations in Vienna. I'm not sure exactly what his post title is, but he's basically a big Russian diplomat in Vienna. He got into a Twitter spat with a fella, which as I say, the fella's just going to come back with nonsense, and Mikhail Ulyanov and was just going round and round and round in circles, just increasingly talking rubbish to each other, and he ended up tweeting this fantastic line. He just tweeted, You pronounce this nonsense, not me. And it was just, it just struck a chord. It's such an act of like a desperate cry to get out of this argument, but I don't want to get out of this argument because I want to win the argument, but I can't let go of you because you've got me locked in some ridiculous headhold with a Shiba Inu cartoon dog. And it was just such a brilliantly stupid phrase. You pronounce this nonsense, not me, that it's now taken as one of the sort of bylines for the fellas. So put on any kind of a photograph of Putin saying something ridiculous, or their guy in the UN, and just slap "you pronounce this nonsense, not me" across it, and I don't know, it makes me smile, and that's what's coming on my T-shirt.
Thank you very much, Dom. I think the thing it reminds me of is actually what you said earlier, how previously with Russian disinformation, often organisations and journalists and fact-checkers found that it's almost like, as you said, fighting smoke. And now this is actually the other way around, that the Russian accounts and the Russian diplomats are fighting smoke when they fight the fellas. They just can't do it, and they make themselves look ridiculous while doing it. So thank you very much, Dom, for that. If you'd like to get in touch about that or ask any questions, please do slide into our DMs. We will try and get some fellas on later this week to give us a bit more of an understanding from their side of what the kind of stuff that they are doing. We're starting to run out of time, however. So Dom, Francis and Joe, can I just ask for your final thoughts? What should our listeners be thinking of going into this week?
Well, for me, it's got to be the emerging news out of Kherson. We have to hold our confidence in check here. We are watching this almost live time with social media, and we could very easily think, oh, it's going great. No, it's going terribly. As each different tweet comes in, have the confidence to hold the time down, as my old drill instructor used to say. Just this is going to take a long time. There's a lot to do here. There's a huge amount of effort being expended, and keep an eye on the news. We are running our live blog, so keep an eye on that. We're here every day. Do question every piece of information you receive, including from us, because we get it wrong sometimes. Check from other sources of information, but do stay up to date. Things seem to be moving quickly, and there's a lot at stake this week, I fear.
I would just echo that. All attention has to be on this new offensive. Something struck me from somebody who messaged me, actually, which is that they were making the point that, of course, Ukraine has been underestimated throughout this war in many ways, and perhaps this is the first moment that many commentators begin to question that notion in terms of their military strength. But that got me thinking about, I've spoken a lot on the podcast about this danger inherent in the months ahead as winter hits, and that Europe, with the energy crisis being as severe as it is, may well begin to lose interest in the war. Perhaps there will be politicians who will be put under pressure to try and force some sort of ceasefire, etc. But it got me thinking, as I say, as to perhaps we underestimate Europeans. You know, that time and time again, I think, actually, if you look at the history of Europe, broadly speaking, people in democratic nations make the right call. And I think actually I've been very struck that the longer we've done this podcast, the more messages we've received from around the world and from within Europe. People are following this war very closely, and they do know what is at stake here, perhaps more so even than the political class is willing to acknowledge. And so if Ukraine has been underestimated, I don't think we should be guilty of underestimating the Europeans, because it is very, very clear that their attention is very much on this, and I think they will be willing to make sacrifices for the greater good.
Thank you very much, Francis and Dom. Joe Barnes, would you like the final words?
Sure. So obviously the kind of counter-offensive from Kherson is the main thing, but let's just kind of take a step back to Europe. So kind of the EU is back and revving this week, and its defence and foreign ministers are meeting in Prague as we speak. And so two things that we should see announced from the EU is a plan for the EU to start funding the training mission that's been undertaken by the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, and various other kind of European and world Western nations to bring kind of Ukrainian soldiers up to speed. And the other one will be the EU will announce some sort of plan for limiting Russian tourist visas. It won't be a full blanket ban. Yesterday, France and Germany issued a kind of what they call a non-paper, which is just kind of almost a proposal, their ideas on a bit of paper before this meeting, saying that we don't think a full blanket ban on Russian tourists is wise. But what we will see is probably some sort of scheme that makes it harder, more expensive for Russians to get tourist visas in Europe, while not closing kind of these humanitarian corridors for kind of anti-war Russians hoping to escape the clutches of Vladimir Putin's government in Moscow and other areas.
If I could just jump in very quickly, I'm sorry, folks. I know I said goodbye, and we've all got other things to be getting on with. But if I could just make an appeal, please, to anyone, particularly from Australia, who listen to us regularly. Thank you for listening in. I can't talk about my diary much, but if I were to be in front of your Defence Minister, Australia's Deputy Prime Minister, in the next 24 hours. What kind of questions would you like me to raise? I just asked that off the top of my head. I'm not saying I am, but if I am, I'd appreciate any DMs. Thanks.
Well, no idea where Dom's going to be tomorrow. Thank you very much, Dom, Francis, and Joe, for your expertise and your thoughts. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.